On July 17, 2019, inside a crowded federal courtroom in Brooklyn, New York, one of the most notorious criminals of our era finally heard his fate. Joaquin El Chapo Guzman, once the untouchable leader of the Sinaloa Cartel, was sentenced to life in a U.S. prison, plus an additional 30 years. He was also ordered to forfeit an unprecedented $12.6 billion. This was not just a punishment, it was a statement. The judge emphasized that the scale of Guzman's crimes, the violence unleashed by his empire, and the audacity of his operations demanded the harshest penalty the law could deliver. But the question lingered: how do you truly imprison a man who embarrassed governments, escaped Mexico's most secure prisons, and controlled a global drug empire? Over the next 25 minutes, we'll explore the worldwide manhunt that brought him down, the overwhelming evidence that crushed his defense, the dramatic legal battles, and where El Chapo is now inside America's most secure prison. So who was El Chapo, and why did he matter? Joaquin Archivaldo Guzman Loera was born in 1957 in a remote mountain village in Sinaloa, Mexico. His early years were defined by poverty, limited education, and the harsh reality of a region where the drug trade was often seen as the only way out. By the late 1970s, Guzman had entered the business, working under established traffickers and learning the routes, contacts, and ruthless strategies that would later define his reign. He earned the nickname El Chapo, meaning shorty, because of his small stature. But his influence was anything but small. Rising to power, he transformed the Sinaloa Cartel into one of the largest and most profitable criminal organizations in history, trafficking billions of dollars worth of cocaine, heroin, methamphetamine, and marijuana into the United States and beyond. What set him apart was his adaptability. He forged alliances, bribed officials, and employed sophisticated smuggling methods, from cross-border tunnels to hidden compartments in cargo shipments. For decades, he evaded rivals and authorities alike, becoming both feared and mythologized. For U.S. prosecutors, his capture was not just about one man, it was about dismantling a system that had kept him untouchable. By the early 2000s, El Chapo was a ghost to law enforcement, always one step ahead. After 13 years on the run, Mexican authorities captured him in 2014 at a luxury condo in Mazatlan. But in July 2015, he staged one of the most audacious prison escapes in history, disappearing through a mile-long tunnel dug directly into his cell's shower. The tunnel had lighting, ventilation, and even a modified motorcycle on rails, proof of meticulous planning and deep corruption. His escape humiliated the Mexican government and reignited his legend as the escape artist of the century. But in January 2016, his luck ran out. After a bloody raid in Los Mochis, he was recaptured. This time, officials knew the United States would demand custody, and they would not risk losing him again. On January 19, 2017, Guzman was extradited to the U.S. in a heavily guarded operation. Mexican and American officials coordinated military escorts, convoys, and strict secrecy. By the time news broke, El Chapo was already en route to New York. Federal prosecutors in the Eastern District of New York had built a sweeping case, uniting evidence from multiple countries. The indictment charged him with trafficking, murder, kidnapping, and bribery, backed by witness testimony and mountains of seized records. This trial, beginning in October 2018, was quickly labeled the trial of the century. Security was extraordinary. Every morning, armed U.S. Marshals transported Guzman from his Manhattan cell to Brooklyn, even shutting down parts of the Brooklyn Bridge. Jurors remained anonymous and under guard. Inside, the courtroom was tense, with journalists filling every seat and spillover rooms set up for the overflow. Prosecutors presented an avalanche of evidence: intercepted phone calls, encrypted messages, financial records, smuggling routes, and testimony from former cartel members. They revealed cocaine shipments hidden in produce trucks, submarines built for smuggling, and bribes worth millions. Witnesses detailed Guzman's personal orders for assassinations, kidnappings, and drug deals. The defense tried to discredit these witnesses, arguing that they were criminals seeking reduced sentences. They also suggested that Guzman was not the true mastermind, pointing instead to Ismael El Mayo Zambada. But prosecutors countered with consistency. Multiple independent sources all confirmed Guzman's command of the cartel. On February 12, 2019, the jury returned a unanimous verdict, guilty on all counts. The trial had dismantled the myth of his invincibility. Sentencing day arrived on July 17, 2019. The Brooklyn courthouse was surrounded by extraordinary security. Inside, Judge Brian Cogan delivered the ruling: life in prison plus 30 years, along with a $12.6 billion forfeiture order. For El Chapo, it was the end of his reign and the beginning of a life behind bars in America's most secure prison, ADX Florence in Colorado, a place designed to ensure there would be no more escapes, no more bribes, and no more second chances. He described the vast scale of Guzman's drug empire: hundreds of tons of narcotics smuggled into the United States, murders carried out to protect shipments, and corruption that weakened institutions on both sides of the border. The judge declared that the damage caused by Guzman's cartel was overwhelming, and the law required the harshest penalty available. The sentence was delivered calmly and deliberately: life in prison without parole, plus 30 years for weapons charges. Judge Brian Cogan also ordered Guzman to forfeit $12.6 billion, an amount calculated from estimates of the cartel's U.S. drug profits during his leadership. While it was unlikely the government could ever recover such a figure, the judgment stood as a symbolic reminder of the magnitude of his crimes. Throughout the hearing, Guzman showed little visible reaction. When given the chance to speak, he complained about the inhumane conditions of his pre-trial confinement and accused the trial of being unfair. His words, however, had no effect. The verdict was final. For prosecutors and agents who had pursued him for years, this was the moment they had worked toward: the removal of one of the world's most notorious drug traffickers from power. For Guzman, it marked the end of decades spent evading capture, escaping prison, and running an empire that once seemed untouchable. He left the courthouse that day not as a feared kingpin, but as a federal inmate bound for the most secure prison in the United States. After sentencing, Guzman's final destination was kept secret for security reasons. Within weeks, he was quietly transferred from New York to the United States Penitentiary Administrative Maximum Facility in Florence, Colorado, better known as ADX Florence. Often called the Alcatraz of the Rockies, it is the most secure federal prison in the nation, designed to hold the most dangerous inmates in near total isolation. ADX Florence houses only a few hundred prisoners, many considered escape risks, terrorist leaders, or high-profile organized crime figures. Guzman joined the ranks of infamous inmates such as the Unabomber Ted Kaczynski, 9/11 conspirator Zacarias Moussaoui, and leaders of rival drug cartels. His prisoner number, published by the Bureau of Prisons, marked him as just another inmate in a place built to ensure no one could ever slip away. Life at ADX stands in stark contrast to the power and freedom he once enjoyed. Prisoners spend about 23 hours a day alone in 7 by 12-foot cells with a small window angled toward the sky to prevent any view of the horizon. Meals are eaten alone, communication is heavily restricted, and visits are rare. Exercise consists of an hour in a concrete enclosure often described as a box. Contact with the outside world is minimal and closely monitored. For U.S. authorities, Guzman's placement in ADX was a direct answer to the embarrassment caused by his previous escapes in Mexico. Here, tunneling, bribery, or outside rescue are virtually impossible. At 66 years old, with a life sentence plus 30 years, the likelihood of him ever leaving ADX alive is almost non-existent. The man who once commanded one of the most powerful criminal empires in history now lives in silence and solitude. Even behind the walls of ADX, Guzman was not ready to surrender without a fight. In July 2020, his lawyers filed an appeal with the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Second Circuit, seeking to overturn his conviction or at least secure a new trial. They argued that jurors had violated court instructions by following media coverage during the trial. Defense lawyers cited an article suggesting that some jurors had seen headlines and social media posts about Guzman while deliberations were ongoing, potentially influencing their decision. Another claim focused on the extreme pretrial conditions Guzman faced at the Metropolitan Correctional Center in Manhattan, where near-total isolation and heavy restrictions allegedly made it impossible for him to prepare for trial. The defense also attacked the credibility of prosecution witnesses, many of them convicted traffickers hoping for reduced sentences, arguing that they had strong incentives to exaggerate or lie. Prosecutors countered each argument, pointing out the safeguards taken to protect jury impartiality and reminding the appellate court that the evidence against Guzman was overwhelming, consistent, and drawn from many independent sources beyond testimony. On January 25, 2022, the Second Circuit rejected the appeal. The court found no proof of juror misconduct and upheld the strict confinement measures as justified given Guzman's history of prison escapes. The conviction and life sentence stood. While a petition to the U.S. Supreme Court remained possible, the odds were extremely slim. For Guzman, the ruling cemented the reality that his life would end in prison. Guzman's removal from the streets did not end the Sinaloa Cartel. Instead, it marked a shift. His longtime partner, Ismael El Mayo Zambada, remained at large, maintaining a lower profile while still controlling major operations. Meanwhile, Guzman's sons, known as Los Chapitos, emerged as a new leadership bloc. Ivan Archivaldo, Jesus Alfredo, Joaquin Jr., and Ovidio Guzman inherited their father's networks, wealth, and enemies. Unlike their predecessors, Los Chapitos flaunted their wealth on social media, presenting themselves with brash confidence. This generational change fueled internal tensions as rival factions vied for territory. Violence erupted in regions across Mexico as the cartel sought to defend its dominance against both competitors and internal challengers. Law enforcement pressure also intensified. In October 2019, Mexican forces briefly captured Ovidio Guzman in Culiacan, only to release him after cartel gunmen unleashed chaos across the city, forcing the government into retreat. In January 2023, Ovidio was recaptured in another large-scale operation and later extradited to the United States to face trafficking charges. Yet, despite high-profile arrests, the cartel adapted. Its decentralized structure allowed operations to continue with little disruption. Today, the Sinaloa Cartel remains one of the most powerful criminal organizations in the world. When Guzman was finally sentenced to life, many wondered whether it would mark a turning point in the war on drugs. But the reality proved far more complex. Experts explain that cartels like Sinaloa operate like multinational corporations. Removing one leader causes disruption, but the machinery continues. Supply chains remain intact, drugs continue to flow, and demand remains strong. Street-level availability of methamphetamine and fentanyl has shown little sign of slowing since Guzman's imprisonment. What did change was perception. His capture and trial demonstrated that even the most elusive criminals could be brought down. It highlighted the importance of international cooperation and set a model for future high-value target operations. Still, the removal of one kingpin rarely dismantles an entire network. In some cases, it sparks even greater violence as rivals compete to fill the void. From the mountains of Sinaloa to a soundproof cell in the Rockies, Joaquin El Chapo Guzman's story is one of rise, reign, and downfall. For decades, he built an empire on corruption, fear, and narcotics that fueled addiction and violence across borders. Twice he escaped maximum security prisons. Twice he humiliated governments. But in the end, his fate was sealed not by tunnels or bribes, but by evidence and a courtroom verdict. Today, he lives in near total isolation, stripped of the power he once wielded. His downfall is a reminder that even the most feared figures in organized crime can be captured, but also a warning. The system they build often survives long after they are gone.